Our guest today is Robert Spencer, one of the world's leading experts on Islamic ideology, jihadist movements, and Middle Eastern history. He's the author of more than 24 books, including The Palestinian Delusion, The Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process. And he's actually our first interview on our Stand Tall Israel channel, and it's a pleasure and an honor to have you. Thank you for being here with us. Mr. Spencer, I want this to be an eye-opening conversation today. Yeah, for those people that woke up on October 7th, basically, and didn't know what's going on with this conflict, why is there always fighting in this little piece of land? Give us, the historical and all the misconceptions that might be concerning this land, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, well, October 7th was just one of the more recent episodes in an ongoing jihad that started in earnest really in the early part of the 20th century when there was large-scale Jewish immigration into Palestine. Now, even when I say that, it's susceptible to tremendous misunderstanding because people who are uninformed historically say, you see, there was Palestine and then the Jews showed up and that caused all the trouble. Actually, what this was the ancestral homeland of the Jews, some of whom, the Yishuv, had lived there throughout history. And then there was, because of the Zionist movement, an influx of those who had been in exile for many centuries back to this ancestral homeland. Palestine was the name of the region that the Romans had given to Judea and Samaria in the year 134 CE. Now, they renamed Judea Palestine because they were exiling the Jews from that ancestral homeland after the Bar Kokhba revolt, because they wanted to insult the Jews and sever their obvious connection to this land. They wanted to efface the name of it, that was land of the Jews, Judea, and call it something else. What else to call it? They went to the Bible, found the Philistines, which was the name of the ancient enemy of the Israelites, according to the scriptures, and consequently, they named the place after them. Now, there are today Palestinian Arab spokesmen who claim, well, this is because we are the Philistines. But there is actually no historical continuity. The Philistines had, long before the Romans called the place Palestine, had died out, and there were no Philistines. They only chose this name to insult the Jews. Anyway, 20th century, the Jews are returning in large numbers, starting in the late 19th century, of course, and the Arab Muslims are enraged. There's so many myths and lies about this issue, and one of them is that the Arabs welcomed in the Jewish immigrants, which is completely ridiculous. The Arab Muslims were enraged at the Zionist movement because they believed that the land belonged to them. Why did the land belong to them? Because the Quran and Islamic tradition and law teach that any land that belonged to the Muslims at any point in history belongs to the Muslims forever. And if there is any land, which has actually only rarely happened, that any land ceases to be ruled by Muslims after it had been, then it is the responsibility before Allah of those Muslims to wage war to get that land back. As the Quran says twice, drive them out from where they drove you out. And so a lot of people think that when people quote it nowadays, refers to the so-called Nakba of 1948, when the Israelis allegedly expelled the Palestinians from the land, which isn't actually the case either. But actually, when Muslims invoke this passage from the Quran, they are doing so on the basis of the fact that the Arab invaders, starting in the 7th century, and then the Turks after them, the Ottomans, ruled the land by Islamic law. And consequently, the Muslims have the responsibility to wage jihad to drive them out from where they drove you out. When the state of Israel was founded, the 5 Arab states surrounding it immediately declared war. And that was when actually the Arab Higher Committee told the Arab Muslims of the area to leave, because they thought they were going to destroy the Jewish state in a matter of weeks. and they wanted to get them out of the line of fire. Instead, they lost the war. And this is the beginning of the idea that there is this massive population of Palestinian refugees. But I know I'm going on a bit, but there's so much to this. I could just actually just talk for an hour here. But I'll conclude for the moment with this, that in all of this that I've just roughly outlined, the Romans' activity in the 2nd century, the beginning of the Zionist movement, the establishment of the State of Israel, nowhere were there actually any Palestinians. And throughout history, you can look at histories of the region and people, accounts of travelers throughout the region, and you don't find any mention of Palestinians. The Palestinians never existed as a distinct people. The people who were there, besides the Jews who had always lived there, and some Christians who had lived there throughout history as well, from the founding of Christianity, there were also some Arab Muslims, and they were indistinguishable ethnically, linguistically, culturally, and religiously from the Arabs of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and so on. The idea of the Palestinians was actually invented in the 1960s as a rhetorical weapon to use against the state of Israel by claiming that these are the real indigenous people of the land who have the prior rights of the land over that of the Israelis, and those who care about the oppressed and brown people and indigenous people and all that, they have to support the Palestinians. And that's where we are. But the whole thing is actually the most successful propaganda initiative in the history of the world. And the Palestinians do not actually exist.
Okay, so from what you're saying, this started way before 1948. Could you speak a little bit about the anti-Jewish riots and violence that there was in Israel before 1948, the Hebron massacre and things like that?
Yeah, this is very important because many of them were led and incited by Haj Amin Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And he, of course, is notorious for the famous photograph of him with Hitler, but it was much more than just a photo op. Al-Husseini actually lived in Berlin from 1941 to 45. He collaborated closely with the National Socialists. He actually was friends with Himmler and Eichmann. He made broadcasts in Arabic to the Arabic-speaking countries, calling upon them to ally with the Germans. He raised up a Muslim SS division out of Bosnian Muslims. And it also seems as if he may have given the Nazis the idea for the gas chambers that were used in the Holocaust, because he saw primitive gas chambers being used by the Turks against the Armenians in the Armenian genocide. He was a soldier in the Ottoman army at that time. And it's noteworthy that Hitler, in speaking about eradicating the Jews, made a direct analogy with the Armenians and said, even today, who remembers the Armenians? And you got to wonder, why do you remember the Armenians, Adolf? Was somebody talking to you about them? Maybe. But even aside from that, even aside from speculation on that, we know that he agitated with the Nazis to not allow Jews to escape from Europe and go to Palestine. And he told them, you got to figure out another solution here. That's when the gas chambers started to be constructed. Now, long before this, in the early 20s, he was working with the British, who were occupying the territory under the Mandate for Palestine, which was given by the League of Nations to the British for the purpose of establishing a Jewish national home, which is Israel. So the British, although they were committed to establishing a Jewish national home, were actually quite opposed to the idea in practice. There were some who were for it, but more often than not, British officials wanted to work with the Arabs. The Arabs had helped them against the Ottomans during World War I. It's the whole Lawrence of Arabia business. Colonel T.E. Lawrence was the British official who worked with the Arabs to agitate and get them to fight the Ottomans, and which helped the British because the Ottomans were on the German side. So after the war, they felt this tremendous gratitude to the Arabs, and they thought of the Zionist Jewish settlers as an irritant, as an afterthought. So they worked in various ways to try to discourage the Zionist settlement. And one of the most evil of these ways was they actually encouraged Haj Amin al-Husseini to massacre Jews in the area. And they told him that if he did so, they would not far be it would they prosecute him. That was not on anybody's mind. They would reward him. And so he did carry out a series of massacres in Jerusalem, as well as in Hebron and elsewhere. And the British didn't do anything but issue white papers saying, we got to restrict Jewish settlement here. And so he went from that to Germany. And after the war, even though he could easily have been prosecuted at Nuremberg for war crimes, he was allowed to escape to Egypt, where he was instrumental in formulating the new Arab resistance, or Jihad, really, against the state of Israel. And of course, he is also remembered today as the uncle of Yasser Arafat.
It's interesting to hear about this Nazi alliance with this early jihad ideology. You would think that they didn't have much in common, but their Jew hatred, right? I mean, is that what united them, or was it something else?
Well, there was a little bit more. That was certainly the main reason. And if you look at the text, I've got some extensive quotes in the Palestinian Delusion, text of al-Husseini's speeches in Arabic to the Arab Muslims during World War II. He's leaning heavily on Quranic passages that are attacking the Jews. And so he's saying, we all hate Jews together, allied with the Germans who are killing them. But there was a little bit more, because Hitler actually is quoted as saying that it's a shame that Charles Martel stopped the Muslims in their advance into France at Tours in the year 732, which was the high water mark of the Islamic advance into Western Europe until today, of course. And he said, it is a shame, it was a great misfortune for the German people that the Muslims didn't advance and conquer Germany, because a German population that was Muslim would have been invincible. He said Christianity, with its meekness and flabbiness, is not suited to the martial spirit of the German people in the way that Islam is, and that Islam would have been a much better religion for them.
Is it possible to speak a little bit about the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood and where that went from there?
Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood is an international organization that was founded in 1928 in order to restore the caliphate. The caliphate is the only political entity to which Muslims should give their allegiance, according to Islamic law. Now, of course, this is problematic in practice because today there is no caliphate. But according to the theory in Islamic law, there is a successor, a caliph. Khilafah is successor, and the caliph is the successor of Muhammad as the military, political, and spiritual leader of all the Muslims worldwide. There have been great caliphates in history, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, and so on. But none of them actually ruled all the Muslims in the world. But that is the theory, that this is the only legitimate government to which Muslims owe allegiance. It's a very important aspect of Islamic theology that the Muslims be a political entity and also a unified, single political entity. So, in 1924, an extraordinary thing happened. The founder of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was also very evil in his own way, but that's a different story. He actually was unique in the entire history of Islam in blaming Islam for the Ottomans' loss in World War I. And he said the West is Christian or secular, and they won. And we need to establish a Western-style secular republic in the way that the West has, and get rid of Islam, which he called the theology of an immoral Bedouin. And so he established secular Turkey, which still exists, although it's much less secular than it was when he started it, and it's not going to be secular at all for much longer. But in any case, he established it, and in 1924, he abolished the caliphate. The last caliphs were the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. And so first of course, the Ottoman Empire had dissolved, but he kept the caliph on because he was still the religious leader of the Muslims. But in 1920, got rid of that as well. So The Muslim Brotherhood, 4 years later, is designed to restore the caliphate, to restore this important unity, political unity of the Muslim world. And they blame a lot of the troubles of the Islamic world on the fact that it is disunited and under the thrall of the Western democracies. So the Muslim Brotherhood establishes itself all over the world. Even today, it's pretty much the largest Muslim organization. I'd be surprised if there were another that were larger. Every major Muslim group in the United States is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas calls itself the Muslim Brotherhood for Palestine. And the whole idea is to wage jihad all around the world, whether by violent or stealthy means. In the United States, they're not blowing stuff up. They're doing it by stealthy means, infiltration and influence operations and so on. And the whole idea is ultimately to establish a caliphate. And Israel has to be destroyed, of course, as part of that, because in the first place, it's on Muslim land, as I explained before. And also, it's a particular insult to Islam because it is ruled by Jews. And the Jews, according to the Quran, are the worst enemies of the Muslims. And so their foremost opponents have established a state on land that belongs to Islam. The Brotherhood and its various offshoots think that's a terrible insult. This is why in the Hamas charter, it actually says Israel will arise and remain until Islam obliterates it. And that's a quote from Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that's been sufficiently appreciated, particularly in Washington, but also in Jerusalem and elsewhere, that it's not, they don't say the Palestinians until the Palestinians obliterate it or until the Arabs obliterate it. They say until Islam obliterates it. And you've got Iran, you've got the Palestinian Authority, you've got Hezbollah, you've got Hamas, you've got all of them. Whenever they speak about this conflict in general, they speak about Islam. And yet in every communique from every American president, they never mention Islam at all. And it seems to me you guys are missing what they're telling us about what this conflict is all about. And that is a recipe for making sure that your solutions will never work, as they never have.
Could you speak a little bit more about why Islam hates Judaism so much, and what is the root over there? Yeah.
Quran says that it is a new revelation that is the confirmation of what is in the Torah and the gospel. And that if the Jews and the Christians look in their books, they will find that Islam is true. Now, of course, Jews and Christians have looked in their books and they don't find Islam is true. And this is the famous Islamic dilemma that is getting a lot of publicity lately, that the Quran tells Jews and Christians to consult their own books to determine if Islam is true. But when they do, they don't find that it's true. And so Muslims charge that the Jews and Christians have actually dared to tamper with their own holy books. And so not only are the Jews the worst enemies of the Muslims, but they're enemies of God as well, because they have taken his revelations and dared to alter them to suit themselves. Now, Islam does not just make theological statements like that and leave them. Islam is a political religion as well as, it's political as well as religious. So when you say the Jews are renegades who have rejected Allah, rejected his true prophet, rejected the latest holy book, and are actually tampering with their holy book and are the enemies of the Muslims and of Allah, well, then you come up against a very important passage of the Quran that is also very frequently overlooked. And that is chapter 9, verses 14 and 15, which says, fight them and Allah will punish them by your hands. Allah will punish them by your hands. That is, you are the executors of the divine punishment. The Muslims are the ones who bring the wrath of Allah to the disbelievers. And so it's not just that the Jews are enemies of Allah and the Muslims who have rejected the true prophet and tampered with their scriptures. It is also that the Muslims have the responsibility to fight them so that Allah can punish them. And this is why, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran hates Israel. Iran doesn't have a border with Israel. Iran doesn't have competing economic interests with Israel. There's no reason for those two countries to be enemies except Islam. That the Quran says all these things about the Jews, and there's much more. I could go on for hours also about the Jew hatred that is in the Quran and Sunnah. But It's because of that that Iran hates Israel, and only because of that.
Let's speak a little bit about the birth of Hamas and the history of Hamas and throughout the decades.
Well, to understand the birth of Hamas, you have to understand in the first place that when Yasser Arafat invented the Palestinians in 1964, he did so in collaboration with the KGB. Yasser Arafat, you may recall, always wore military fatigues, or often wore military fatigues. And he was, in other words, he was not wearing the garb of a sheikh. He was not dressed as a Muslim leader. He was the leader of an insurgent movement of militants that were allied with the communists if they weren't communists themselves. Of course, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is openly Marxist. But Arafat was very much aligned with all of that when he started out. In the 60s, you have the KGB and Arafat inventing the Palestinians and casting them as a movement of the oppressed, colonized, oppressed brown people against the white colonialist oppressors, the Israelis. And so it's all Marxist rhetoric about oppressor versus oppressed. And at that time, they did not speak a great deal about Islam. Now, Islam was always in the background because they were all Muslims. And the only reason why they wouldn't have an agreement, an ordinary agreement, such as people have had throughout history in thousands of different contexts, you have a disagreement, you compromise, each side compromises a little bit, and you take what you can get, and that's it. But in this case, there's never any agreement that ever works because Islam is maximalist. It demands the whole thing. Drive them out from where they drove you out, not just drive them out of part of it and leave them the rest in a two-state solution or something like that. Drive them out, all of it. So they're not talking about Islam, but Islam is in the background. They're talking about the oppressed, Marxism, fighting against the occupier, the oppressor, and all that. And of course, that's still very much part of the rhetoric and why the left has fallen for this so hard. But there was always a faction among the Palestinian Arabs that considered that illegitimate and wanted to talk more freely and openly about the fact that this was an Islamic conflict. And so they started Hamas in 1987 as a competitor to the Palestinians, to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that later became the Palestinian Authority in the 90s, because they thought that these people weren't sufficiently Islamic. And so they are open about their desire to destroy all of Israel. They don't want to sit down and talk and negotiate and divide up the land. They want to destroy Israel totally because that's the Islamic imperative. Now, the PLO and the PA, they actually hold to all this too. But because it had been so muted in their rhetoric, and because they were willing to sit down and negotiate and use the negotiations, mind you, step by step to work toward destroying Israel, they thought that it would be better, the people who founded Hamas, to create a more explicitly Islamic movement.
So could you speak a little bit about, the Oslo Accords, how every peace deal failed, Arafat kind of fooling the West into thinking that he actually wanted peace, and so on and so forth?
Yeah. Well, Oslo is, of course, one of a string of failed accords that goes back to Camp David and continues. Camp David is still enforced to some degree, but it was terrible from the beginning that Israel was made to withdraw from land it had legitimately won in a defensive war. And it was a rule of warfare throughout history that if you are attacked and you win against an aggressor, you can seize territory to protect yourself against further attacks from that aggressor. Everybody took that for granted. That's why Germany is so much smaller now than it was before World War II. But when it comes to Israel, it doesn't apply. So Israel was made to withdraw from Sinai and so on, and it was only in exchange for promises that have turned out to be, to a tremendous degree, empty. But in any case, the reasons why these negotiations always fail is exactly what I've been explaining, that jihad is not negotiable. There is no way that a pious believing Muslim is going to say, I will stop trying to destroy Israel because we made this agreement. Because destroying Israel, as far as he's concerned, is serving Allah. And just as a Jew or Christian is not going to say, well, let's sit down, I'll negotiate away the sixth commandment if you make a good deal, we'll just scratch that one out. It's not negotiable. You always have it there. And it's the same thing with the drive them out from where they drove you out. They can't erase it from the Quran. So Arafat would lie. Now, he would lie because lying is allowed in these kinds of contexts. In the first place, Muhammad said, war is deceit. War is deceit. And he allowed for lying between a husband and a wife. The husband could lie to the wife all he wants, and in wartime. And of course, most importantly, in wartime, you can make your enemies think you're on their side. This is the wording of Maulana Maududi, who was a very famous Pakistani politician and Islamic scholar in the 20th century. And in explaining the Quran, where it says, don't take infidels as your friends and protectors in preference to believers. Whoever does that has nothing to do with the law, unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them. That's chapter 3, verse 28. Maududi explained that by saying, this means that we can pretend to be on the side of our enemies if it's tactically necessary. So that's what he did at Oslo. He agreed to all these things. He went home, people were angry. And he said, don't worry about it. It's Hudaybiyah. What's Hudaybiyah? This is a treaty that Muhammad concluded according to Islamic tradition in the year 628. In the year 628, he was fighting the Meccans, who were the pagan Arabs. He was from Mecca, but they had rejected his claim to be a prophet. And he asked them to conclude an agreement. They were the stronger party, and they agreed to conclude this agreement with him, whereby they would not fight for 10 years. He was only using it to have a respite from the fighting so that he could gather his forces and augment his forces so that he could defeat them later. So long before the 10 years were up, he broke the treaty, and the Meccans were overawed. They saw that he was much more powerful, and they surrendered without a fight. But that is the paradigm for all Islamic treaty making. If you are losing, you ask your enemy for a truce. The truce can last for as long as 10 years. And you use that time to gather strength to fight again more effectively. So Arafat went home and he told the people in Arabic, this is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. He meant, we're just biding our time and gathering strength. This is not a real truce like we're making peace and going to live side by side in peace with Israel. And meanwhile, Bill Clinton, he didn't know any of this. And he just thought, well, I've just made peace. I'm going to get me a Nobel Prize. And he thought that he was going to actually bring this whole conflict to an end. But I don't mean to pick on Bill. He wasn't any dumber about this than any other American president. Every last one of them has thought they're going to solve this problem. And they think that they're going to do so because they don't understand Islam. And they don't understand it when Arafat says something like, this is Hudaybiyah. And they don't care to be told. So they keep making the same mistakes again and again and again.
You mentioned the presidents. So what's currently happening right now with, Donald Trump trying to make, saying there's peace. What do you have to say about that?
The same thing. He wants a Nobel Prize too. And maybe he'll get one, but it'd be just as hollow as the one they gave to Jimmy Carter and, all the rest of it, and Arafat for that matter. The president is making exactly the same mistake that has been made by all the other presidents. And that is thinking that this is a conflict that the opponents are thinking of in Western terms. In the West, you have a war for a while, and one side is winning, and the other side surrenders and signs a paper saying it's all done. That's not what happens in Jihad. In Jihad, they only sign a paper, like I said, to get 10 years to gather their strength to fight again. There is no doubt whatsoever, no doubt whatsoever that this treaty that Trump has touted so wholeheartedly is going to fail. And Trump is going to attack it. Hamas is going to attack Israel again. And Israeli civilians are going to get killed again. And he stopped them from eradicating Hamas, which also would not have ended the jihad, but would have set it back maybe decades. And he stopped them because he thought he's a deal maker and we're going to sign this deal and it's going to be the best deal you ever saw. And it's just going to be the same failure we have seen again and again.
Okay, let's speak a little bit about the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the suicide bombings, all that.
Yeah. Well, all of this is just more of the jihad. When they talk about intifada, it's a term of tremendous significance. It means an uprising or shaking off the oppressor, all these things. And people, especially Marxists, love that kind of talk, and they love to style themselves as the oppressor fighting against it appeals to their heroic self-image. But really, the intifadas are just more intensified episodes of jihad. It's all jihad with the ultimate goal of eradicating Israel. Suicide bombings take place because the Quran promises paradise to those who kill and are killed for Allah. Now, this is very important because that's the only promise of paradise in the Quran. See, in Islam, your good deeds are on one scale and your bad deeds are on another. And if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you go to paradise. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. Now, how many good deeds and bad deeds have you committed? And how much does each one weigh? You don't know, right? I don't know. And so imagine if you're a believing Muslim and you really think that this is happening, you could be tormented by the fear of hell, which is very, very lavishly described in the Quran. Allah is going to burn off your skin and then issue you a new skin so he can burn that one off and pour molten lead down your throat and all these terrible things. And forever, it never ends. So, how do you get out of hell? How do you ensure that you don't go to hell? Well, one way is to kill and be killed for Allah. That's the promise of paradise in chapter 9, verse 111. And so, as the only promise of paradise in the Quran, it makes suicide attacks extremely attractive. Also, there's the fact that heaven in the Quran is a big bordello full of babes, and you just have sex for all eternity. So there was a kid about 13 years old, 14, and this was a few years ago, long before October 7th, but he was stopped at a checkpoint in Israel, and he had a bomb strapped on, and the IDF sent out their automated bomb disarmer, which is quite a machine, really, so nobody ends up getting blown up. They don't have to go and untie the bomb from the kid and risk having it detonate. They send this little automated thing out, and it diffuses the bomb and takes it off. So he's standing there. He's standing there in his underwear because they've taken off all his clothes and they're taking off the bomb with the machine. And he calls out to the IDF soldiers, how am I going to get to paradise now and meet the virgins? He takes this very seriously. And it's a great inducement.
Wow. Okay, let's skip to October 7th. The media's double standard showing Israel as an aggressor, Hamas winning the information war and sympathy from the West and all that.
It seems like it was a concerted effort that was planned long before October 7th. That when October 7th took place, immediately there was a PR machine, propaganda machine that was going to roll into action to demonize the Israelis. And I saw this, in real time as it was unfolding. For example, among American conservatives or on the right in America, always very pro-Israel. And then suddenly it turned. And of course, we all know about Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and so on. But I saw a much less well-known figure, a man named Elijah Schaffer, who was working with, he might still be for all I know, a group called Gateway Pundit. And he had a very large following on Twitter, 500,000 people, 700,000 people, something like that. And I saw on October 8th, 2023, that he said, what Hamas did yesterday was terrible. And what Israel is doing today is terrible. I thought, Israel isn't doing anything today. If you recall, Israel did not go into Gaza for several weeks after October 7th. And Israel wasn't doing a thing on October 8th except reeling from the horror of what had happened. But he was already primed and ready with his Israel is committing genocide. By November, only a month after the October 7th attack, the incoming mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, was accusing Israel of genocide. And I think, you don't have this kind of thing. Those two examples are just two of many without there being some pre-planning that they knew already they were going to, whatever Israel did, they were going to pounce on it and try to portray it in the worst possible light. And of course, wildly exaggerate and lie about it as well. So, yeah.
So why do you think that the Western elites, the universities, media, they all sympathize with these terror groups. Hamas filmed themselves doing what they did on October 7th, and it's still as if that doesn't exist.
Well, a lot of it is the Marxist slant of America's colleges and universities. So they see the world in terms of the oppressor and the oppressed. And when you enter that world, it's like a funhouse mirror, you know. Everything might make sense within it, but it doesn't make any sense with reference to the outside. And it's the same kind of thing. In the universities, if you are an oppressed person, then you can do whatever you want, and they will make excuses for you. Now, you may not really be an oppressed person, you just may have the claim. But if they buy your claim, they'll run interference for you. So the universities have been under the control of Marxists for decades. I mean, when I was in college in the 80s, my professors were all Marxists. And it's only gotten worse since then. And so now you have these professors who are Marxists, and they teach their students that the Palestinians are oppressed people and that the Israelis are white colonialists. And then if something is done, if some jihad attack happens, they say, you see, the oppressor is so oppressive that he drove the oppressed to do this. They had it coming because of all the terrible things that they've done. And there were talking points to this effect. I saw several CARE officials, Council on American Islamic Relations, saying Israel's an occupying power, so it has no right to defend itself. And Hamas, Gaza is occupied, which of course it isn't really, or it hasn't been since 2005. But anyway, Gaza is occupied, and therefore whatever the Gazans do to relieve their plight is justified. And this kind of thing went out all over.
You speak a little bit about the United Nations and the bias that they have and they always had against Israel. And is there anything that could be done?
The United Nations is made up of two major groups, communists and Muslims, just like the left Islamic alliance everywhere. You have communists who hate Israel because they want to establish an internationalist collective, a massive multinational state that is socialist and doesn't have borders because it encompasses everywhere. And they want to destroy the United States because it's the foremost nation state. And if you're warring against the very idea of the nation state, you take out the biggest one, the most important one, and then the others fall into line. And also, if you want to destroy the nation state and establish an international mega state, you also hate the one group of people who've never assimilated into the larger collective throughout history. But they have always resisted and kept to their own traditions, their own customs, their own community. And they weren't attacking the outer community, but they just wouldn't join it. So the international left, although many Jews, of course, are leftists, I would respectfully suggest they have not thought this through. The international left is essentially anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, because even Karl Marx wrote about the necessity for the Jews to stop being Jews, to melt into the larger community as part of the collective. Communism is a collectivist thing. So you got them on the one hand. And on the other, you have the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Now, the Soviet bloc used to be the largest voting bloc at the United Nations. The Soviet Union, of course, fell. That was not the end of communism. As I was just saying, there are plenty of communists still at the UN. But also, the largest voting bloc today is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. 56 Muslim governments plus the Palestinians. And they hate Israel, of course, because of all the Islamic things that I've been explaining. So the two of them work together in the United Nations to demonize Israel. And it's really kind of ridiculous. There's a standing item on the Security Council agenda, item 7. Every time they meet, they talk about Israeli crimes, item 7 on the agenda. No other country gets that kind of treatment. And so you look around the world, you look at North Korea, at Iran, human rights abusers all around the world, and they pick on Israel. And that's because of the communists and the OIC.
Could you speak a little bit? We spoke about the Muslim Brotherhood, but there are Arab countries that ban the Muslim Brotherhood. But in the West, I mean, in the United States, for example, they're still flourishing. So can you speak a little bit on that?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood, there are always attempts to ban it in the United States or get it designated a terrorist group in the United States. And they always fail because Muslim Brotherhood infiltration has already advanced to the point that they can stop any such initiative. And they do. So once again, we see talk about getting the Muslim Brotherhood designated a terror group. And once again, it ain't going to work. Unfortunately, however, it is true. The Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated, according to a captured internal document, to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house. And they're doing that very well. But yeah, there are countries in the Middle East that have banned the Muslim Brotherhood, notably Egypt, the country of its birth, because they don't want to be Sharia states. Egypt is not a Sharia state. Neither is Jordan or some of the other places where the Brotherhood's activities are restricted. They don't want the Brotherhood around because it's a direct challenge to their own authority.
Could you speak a little bit also about Qatar and how they're playing the double game, being the mediators with Hamas and then being friends with the United States? What do you have to say about
Well,
that?
it's a strange case of short-sightedness on the part of Trump. 9 or 10 years ago, he was very clear. Qatar's an international sponsor of terrorism, should not be tolerated. And now we're big pals, and they're going to give him an airplane, and they're going to be negotiating with everybody. It's crazy because Qatar is a chief sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas. They had the Hamas leaders there. You've seen the video footage of them watching October 7th attacks and then getting down and praising Allah for killing Israelis. And these people are this is still the same people in charge of Qatar. They didn't expel them. They didn't say, oh, horrors, we had a change of heart. We shouldn't have had these Hamas guys here. They haven't said a word except Obama. Trump forced Netanyahu to call and apologize for bombing the Hamas leaders in Qatar. Well, has Trump forgotten that they're a chief sponsor of terrorism? Does he really think they're nice guys now? It's incredible short-sightedness, and it's only going to come back to bite us.
Is it possible to defeat Hamas? What does that mean ideologically and militarily?
It is possible to defeat Hamas and destroy it as an organization. Hamas started in 1987, and it could have a death date as well. That's not to say that the jihad will end. The jihad will never end. As long as there are believers in Allah and Islam and the Quran, there will be the jihad. However, that doesn't mean that it will always have this organization or be able to fight at this kind of level of strength. And you look back 100 years ago, that was the time of the founding of secular Turkey, and there was secular movements elsewhere as well. Iran followed Turkey under Reza Shah, followed Turkey and created a Western-style secular society that lasted until 1979 when the Islamic Republic overthrew it. In the 1950s, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, you can see the video on YouTube. He is talking to an audience and he says, the Muslim Brotherhood says all the women should wear hijab. And the audience laughs. And he says, and I told them, you make them wear it. And the audience laughs even harder. And they all are agreed there in Egypt in the late 50s that it's absurd, that Egyptian women are never going to wear hijab. Now you go to Egypt, they all wear hijab. Now, the point is that the jihad was not gone when the Egyptian women were not wearing the hijab and Turkey and Iran were secular. The jihad was still there, but the jihadis were far less powerful and did not have the cultural ascendancy that they do now. So what we need to do is be strong militarily as culturally as well as militarily. They understand that you don't, as a matter of fact, it's Islamic law. You don't wage jihad against an enemy that has more than twice your strength and against whom you have no chance of winning. So if we had projected strength, they would not be fighting. If we had projected strength, there would be more Ataturks saying, we should be like them and give up this Islam that's failed. But we have not projected strength, we've projected weakness. And so we have more jihad. If we had destroyed Hamas, many people would say, maybe Allah does not reward piety in the way that we expected after all. Maybe we should give this up. But since we did not destroy Hamas, Hamas is saying, look, we won because we survived. And so we will press on to final victory. There you go. It's if we had crushed Hamas, there would be a lot less jihad. Not no jihad, but a lot less.
Do you think that there are signs of hope for Israel to I know they cannot fully crush this threat, but what do you think the future looks like?
Well, they're I don't think that it's a bad thing for them to be pursuing these pragmatic accords, the Abraham Accords, that are not based on Islam. They need to understand that there are hardliners in every one of the Abraham Accords countries who think that they're wrong, that they shouldn't make an agreement with the Jews because of what the Quran says, and so on. And really, they only exist because Iran is a threat. And if the Islamic Republic falls, the Abraham Accords will probably fall as well. Nevertheless, the more they can establish working arrangements with those countries, the better off that they are. And that at least is something. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it can at least make life a little bit less immediately threatening for the Israelis.
Do you think that other countries like Saudi Arabia and others could join this Abraham Accords?
Well, Saudi Arabia has made a very clear condition that they will not join unless a Palestinian state is established, and that Israel retreat to the 1967 borders, which of course Abba Eban called the Auschwitz borders. They are very difficult to defend. It's really miraculous that Israel survived for 18 years with those borders when it's only 9 miles from the sea to the border, according to those borders at some points. And that's, with modern warfare, that's hardly anything. And so it would be very foolish if the Israelis were to agree to that. It's remotely possible that Trump might pressure them to do so. We'll see. He's very erratic. But if that's the condition for the Saudi normalization, Israel can live without the Saudi normalization.
Okay, I want to ask you a last question. There's a lot of talk about, America first. We don't need Israel and all that. And obviously, you mentioned Tucker Carlson. Could you speak about why America does need Israel and what America gains from Israel?
There's a tremendous amount of cooperation that I think people don't know about between America and Israel in matters of military hardware and materiel and also intelligence. The Israelis have been extremely generous in sharing various kinds of information with the American government. It's not a one-way alliance in the slightest degree. Also, just in a general sense, America first does not mean and should not mean America alone in the sense of America having no allies. Israel faces a common foe that we face as well. People don't know because they don't study the area, but Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, they have the same ideology 100% as those who struck the United States on 9/11 and who still want to see the United States brought down. And so why should not we ally with Israel? Is the choice then to ally with states that are full of people who hold to the same ideology that wants to destroy us? I don't see that as a better alternative.
Where can people find you, find more about you, purchase one of your books, anything you want to
Yeah,
promote?
I'm at jihadwatch.org. That's JIHAD watch.org, updated many times daily with news about jihad activity, commentary to help you understand it. And that's very important because most everybody lies about what it's all about or just doesn't know. But anyway, that's that. Jihad Watch RS on Twitter X. And the books are at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever fine books are sold. Don't go if you see the sign says, we only sell lousy books, don't go in there. But if you see a bookstore that says fine books sold here, mine will be in there. If you see a bookstore, it is. And anyway, yeah, the books are at Amazon. I have a book, The Palestinian Delusion, about the Middle East peace process and why it always fails. And also Antisemitism, History and Myth, which is a response to really the anti-Semitism we've seen since October 7th. Many other books, The History of Jihad. I have a new book out actually called Intifada on the Hudson, The Selling of Zohran Mamdani, about the new mayor of New York.
Okay. Thank you very much.